The stage was set in New York City's most watched liberal talk show studio, Live with Hinkle. It wasn't just another episode. There was a subtle tension in the air, the kind that even the audience could feel as they filed into their seats. The red, white, and blue lights glowed from behind the velvet curtains, but they did little to soften the sharp edges of what was about to unfold. Tonight's guest was none other than Melania Trump, and while her name alone could fill headlines, it was the man sitting across from her that made this moment dangerous. Jonathan Hinkle, a man who built his reputation on dissecting conservatives, mocking tradition, and spinning every answer into a trap. He was a television veteran with the smirk of a man who believed he was smarter than everyone in the room. This wasn't going to be an interview. It was going to be an ambush. Backstage, Melania sat in the dressing room, her reflection quiet in the mirror. Her wide dress was simple, elegant. Her posture was upright, as always. But her eyes, those calm steel blue eyes, revealed more than she wanted them to. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't scared. But she was tired of the questions, tired of being reduced to her last name, tired of being asked to answer for things that were never hers to carry. But still, she had agreed to come. She had her reasons. Just a few feet away, in a reserved seat shielded from public view, sat her son, Barron Trump. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, a quiet strength in his presence. He hadn't spoken to the producers. He wasn't part of the show. He was just there for her, to watch, to support. That was the plan. Stay quiet, stay out of sight. But Barron had learned something in recent years. Silence could be mistaken for weakness. And tonight, he had a strange feeling. The kind of feeling that made his pulse steady, his thoughts sharper. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing. If they went too far, if they tried to humiliate her on live television, he wouldn't stay in his seat for long. The applause sign flashed above the audience, and with a wave of his hand, Jonathan Hinkle stepped onto the stage. Polished in a deep blue suit with a red tie that felt more ironic than patriotic, he gave the crowd that signature half-smile that said, "Trust me, I'm in control." "Good evening, America," he said, walking slowly to his desk. "Tonight, we welcome someone who has remained largely silent in the storm of American politics. A woman who stood beside one of the most controversial presidents in our nation's history, and who until now has chosen grace over confrontation. That ends tonight." The audience laughed not loudly, but just enough. A mix of cynics and loyal followers of Hinkle's show. They weren't here for answers. They were here for blood. The lights shifted as Melania Trump walked onto the stage. She moved slowly but purposefully, her heels echoing across the polished floor, her face unreadable. She offered a polite nod to the audience, then sat down across from Hinkle without waiting for his gesture. Her presence, as always, was dignified, almost regal. But it was clear from her first breath that this would not be a comfortable evening. "Thank you for being here, Mrs. Trump," Hinkle began, not missing a beat. "You've stayed quiet through a lot. I think it's fair to say people are curious. Do you ever regret it?" Melania tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, measured. "Regret is for those who didn't make a choice. I made mine." The audience didn't know how to react. It wasn't applause-worthy, but it wasn't weak either. It was firm, controlled, and Hinkle didn't like that. He leaned in. "Yes, but your choice. To stand beside a man accused of dividing the country, mocking veterans, attacking the press." She interrupted him, not with volume, but with presence. "Was my husband, and I know him in a way you never will." Backstage, Barron sat forward in his seat. His fingers tightened around the arms of the chair. He knew that look on her face. It was the same one he had seen during the worst moments in the White House when the cameras were off, but the pressure never stopped. This wasn't just an interview. This was a trap. And it had only just begun. Jonathan Hinkle leaned back in his chair, momentarily taken aback by Melania's calm rebuttal. He hadn't expected her to fire back so quickly, and certainly not with that level of quiet precision. His smirk faded for just a second, and the audience, ever sensitive to his body language, grew still. He regained his posture, clasped his hands together, and narrowed his eyes. "You say you know him better than we do," he said. But the American people saw the headlines, the tweets, the chaos. And through it all, you stood there silently. Some might say complicitly. So let me ask you directly. When you saw children separated from their parents at the border, when you heard him mock women and minorities, did you ever feel just for a moment ashamed? There it was, the trap. The audience gasped, some even nodding in anticipation. It was the question that made careers. If she dodged it, they'd call her cowardly. If she answered, they'd twist her words. Hinkle knew that. He had asked it 100 times in 100 different ways to other guests. But this one mattered more. Melania blinked once, her expression unchanged. She didn't reach for the glass of water on the table. She didn't fidget. She simply stared at him. "I have always believed in protecting children," she said, her voice cool but unwavering. "I visited those facilities. I spoke to those families. I did more than hold a microphone and ask dramatic questions in front of bright lights." A murmur ran through the audience. Backstage, Barron stood up from his seat. Slowly, not rushing, not panicked, but focused. His jaw was clenched, his gaze fixed on the stage. He knew this was no longer about policy. This was about his mother's dignity. And the man across from her wasn't interested in truth. He was hunting sound bites. Barron took a step toward the stage entrance. Not because he had planned to speak, but because sometimes silence is no longer an option. The cameras kept rolling, but something in the room had shifted. Even the live audience, so used to laughing on cue and clapping when prompted, had grown quiet. Melania's response wasn't defensive, it wasn't rehearsed. It was the kind of statement that didn't fit into Hinkle's usual framework of control. Jonathan adjusted his notes. He wasn't rattled, not yet, but he could sense that the power in the room had started to tilt. That wasn't acceptable. He cleared his throat and leaned in again, this time lowering his voice as if confiding in her, but everyone knew it was for effect. "Mrs. Trump," he said, with a tone laced in artificial sympathy, "some people might say you were just doing your duty as a wife. Others might say you turned a blind eye to cruelty. But I wonder, as a mother, did you ever think about what message you were sending to your son?" Melania's eyes didn't flinch, but her lips pressed into a firmer line. The question hadn't touched her as a former First Lady. It had struck at her core as a parent. And that everyone in the room could feel was a different kind of battlefield. From the side of the stage, a shadow moved. Barron was no longer standing still. He had made it past the curtain and now waited at the edge of the lights. One of the stagehands tried to stop him, whispering frantically, but Barron brushed past without a word. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm forward. He just walked with purpose, with control, toward the center of the stage. Melania turned her head just slightly, her eyes widening, not in fear or surprise, but in realization. Hinkle turned, his mouth opening as if to stop him. But Barron had already stepped between them. He didn't look at the host. He didn't look at the audience. He looked only at his mother. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand and held it firmly, quietly, as if anchoring her to the ground. Only after a long moment of silence did he finally turn to Jonathan Hinkle and say, "Maybe it's time you ask yourself what kind of message you're sending." The room was frozen. And for the first time in his career, Hinkle had no reply. The silence in the studio wasn't just awkward, it was oppressive. A silence that wrapped itself around every person in the room, refusing to let go. Even the sound of the distant stage lights humming seemed louder than the breathing of the crowd. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Jonathan Hinkle, a man who had spent his entire career commanding rooms, now sat motionless in his chair. His lips parted slightly, as if forming a reply, but his voice had betrayed him. He was used to interrupting, to cutting people off, to shifting narratives in real time. But this this was different. This wasn't a politician dodging a question or a celebrity trying to save face. This was a son standing beside his mother, not with rage, but with resolve. Barron remained still. He didn't let go of Melania's hand. His face was calm, but his jaw remained tight. There was no drama in his posture, no theatrical flair. Just a clear message: this ends here. The cameras continued to roll. Producers in the control room were whispering frantically into headsets, unsure if they should cut to commercial. This wasn't what they had planned. They wanted sparks, yes, but not like this. They wanted Melania to squirm, to stumble. They hadn't anticipated that Barron would enter the stage like a quiet storm and shift the entire balance of power. Jonathan finally exhaled and tried to regain his footing. "Well," he said, forcing a half smile, "I wasn't aware we had a second guest this evening." The attempt at levity fell flat. The audience didn't laugh. Some looked uncomfortable. Others stared at Barron with something closer to curiosity or admiration. Barron turned slightly, his voice even and direct. "I didn't come here to be on your show. I came here to support my mother. But watching you turn this conversation into an interrogation made it clear that someone had to speak up." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Support is one thing. But if you think this is an ambush, maybe you haven't watched the news these past few years. Barron didn't blink. "I've watched enough to know when someone is pretending to ask questions while really just performing outrage." That landed. A few audience members nodded, almost involuntarily. The illusion was cracking. Jonathan Hinkle, the ever-composed host, suddenly looked smaller under the lights, less in control, less untouchable. And Melania, still seated, still composed, finally allowed herself the faintest of smiles. Not one of triumph, but one of gratitude. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't alone on the stage. Jonathan Hinkle shifted in his seat, a subtle movement, but one that didn't go unnoticed. For a man whose presence had always filled the stage, his posture now betrayed something he would never admit: discomfort. He glanced at his cue cards, suddenly unsure whether to continue as planned or retreat to safer ground. This wasn't supposed to happen. The narrative had flipped, and worse, it had flipped without theatrics, without shouting, without scandal. Just quiet truth, and that was harder to fight. Barron stood tall beside his mother, hands now at his sides. He wasn't looking for applause, and he certainly wasn't looking for sympathy. He was simply standing where he believed he needed to be, in the face of manipulation, in the face of an audience eager for spectacle, in the middle of a war of words that was never about truth, but about humiliation. Jonathan cleared his throat, attempting a return to control. "You know, Barron," he began, folding his hands together, "I understand defending your family. That's admirable. But this is a political show. Your mother stood next to a man who, let's be honest, was one of the most divisive figures in modern history. Isn't it fair to say she should answer for some of that?" Melania inhaled softly, but before she could speak, Barron stepped forward, not with aggression, but with command. "My mother doesn't owe you an explanation for someone else's decisions," he said. "You've asked your question, over and over. And not just to her, but to anyone who ever dared to care about someone the media didn't like. You don't want an answer. You want a soundbite." The audience shifted again. This wasn't defiance. This was a dismantling. Jonathan sat back. "So what would you have me do, Barron? Sit here and praise your father's legacy? Pretend the last decade didn't happen?" Barron's eyes were calm, but piercing. "I'd have you stop pretending that this is journalism." Melania turned to her son, her expression unreadable but inside. She was reliving every moment she had sat in interviews like this. Every moment she had smiled politely while being picked apart. Every headline, every snide remark, every insult wrapped in a question mark. And now, her son stood before her, not just as a boy grown into a man, but as a shield she never asked for, yet needed more than she realized. Jonathan Hinkle looked down at his desk, the silence once again pressing in. For the first time in his career, it felt like the spotlight was revealing too much. Not about his guests, but about himself. The tension inside the studio had settled into a thick, unspoken fog. No one said a word, but everyone felt it, the shift. The roles had blurred. Jonathan Hinkle, once the orchestrator of pointed questions and viral moments, now sat at his desk like a man watching his carefully rehearsed play unravel before the first act was over. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the polished surface of his desk, searching for the next angle. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. His pride wouldn't allow it. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice steadier now, rehearsed again. "You, Barron Trump, want the American people to just forget everything your father said and did? Just because you're willing to walk onto a stage and defend your mother?" He said it like a challenge, like a trap he hoped still worked. Barron didn't flinch. "I didn't ask anyone to forget," he replied. "I'm not here to rewrite history. I'm here because you didn't invite my mother to speak. You invited her to surrender. And I'm not going to sit in the back while you pretend this is a conversation." There was a rustle in the audience, some gasps, a few quick intakes of breath. Even those who didn't agree with him felt something shift in their chests. There was no arrogance in his tone, no political posturing, just clarity. Jonathan sat back, fingers tapping once against his mug. His smile had vanished completely now. In its place was something closer to calculation. He turned toward Melania, whose gaze had been locked on her son since he stepped forward. "Mrs. Trump," Hinkle said, his voice softening, almost performative, "you've clearly raised a very protective young man. But don't you think his presence here only proves how carefully crafted this appearance really is? A staged interruption, a political stunt." Melania didn't react right away. She blinked slowly, almost too slowly, and then leaned forward just enough for the mic to catch her words. "If this was a stunt," she said with quiet confidence, "you'd still be in control." Hinkle froze. It was a precise blow, wrapped in grace, and it hit harder than any headline. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't leaned on slogans. She had simply drawn a line and left him standing on the wrong side of it. Barron glanced at her briefly, then turned his eyes back to the host. There was still fire behind them, not hatred, not outrage, just the look of someone who'd had enough of watching others pretend they hold the moral high ground while digging trenches beneath it. And Jonathan Hinkle. For the first time in his career, he had no script to follow. The room felt like it had tilted on its axis. What began as just another episode of Live with Hinkle had turned into something else, something raw, uncomfortable, and entirely unscripted. The host, whose name alone once commanded authority in liberal circles, now sat under the very lights he had used to expose others, unsure if they were beginning to expose him instead. He adjusted his collar, trying to recenter the moment. He glanced toward the production booth for reassurance, but the dim glass offered no help, just the vague silhouettes of staff who weren't sure whether to intervene or let the drama play out. Melania remained composed, regal. There was no trace of panic in her voice, no defensive edge in her posture. And that, in many ways, unnerved Jonathan Hinkle more than anything else. He was used to confrontation. What he wasn't used to was calm resistance. He turned to Barron again, clearly hoping to regain some footing. "You talk about dignity, about not letting your mother be ambushed. But don't you think it's dangerous to treat anyone in public life as untouchable? Isn't that the same kind of blind loyalty your family accuses the left of?" Barron tilted his head slightly. He wasn't rattled. He understood what Hinkle was trying to do, wrap his questions in clever framing. Force false choices, create headlines that could live longer than the truth. "My mother's not untouchable," he said evenly. "She's just not disposable." A murmur swept through the crowd, short, sharp. A few audience members blinked, realizing that behind the politics and the headlines, there was something they hadn't considered in a long time, humanity. Hinkle hesitated, just for a second. "Fair," he said. "But let's be honest, your family made a career out of playing victim while holding the most powerful seat in the world. Doesn't that seem a little ironic?" Before Barron could respond, Melania finally spoke. Her voice was low, but crystal clear. "I was First Lady, not a politician, not a general. I didn't order wars. I didn't sign laws. I visited hospitals. I comforted children. And yet, somehow, I've spent more time defending myself than most men who've held real power." That hit harder than any insult could have. The audience grew quiet again, not from intimidation, but from something far rarer in that room, reflection. And Jonathan Hinkle, caught somewhere between pride and realization, stared at her for a moment longer than he meant to, as if he wasn't sure anymore who the interview was really about. For a few seconds, the studio lights seemed dimmer, not because they'd changed, but because the energy in the room had. Something about Melania's last sentence had landed deeper than expected. It had bypassed the political theater and struck at something far more human. In the control booth, one of the producers whispered nervously into a headset, "Do we cut to commercial?" But no one moved. Even behind glass, they felt it. This moment had become too real to interrupt. Jonathan Hinkle blinked once, twice. He leaned back slightly, not in defeat, but in hesitation. He had always prided himself on keeping the upper hand, on being able to pivot, push, provoke. But this wasn't going the way it was supposed to. He looked at Melania, then at Barron, who stood beside her like a pillar. A son, not just protective, but present. The image was striking, and he knew the camera was catching it all. And that's what bothered him most. For years, he had sold his audience certainty. Who was good, who was bad, who should be mocked, who should be believed. But right now, the people sitting across from him didn't fit the narrative. They weren't shouting. They weren't spinning. They weren't even trying to win. They were just there, real. Jonathan tried again, softer now. "If what you say is true, if you did all those things as First Lady, why didn't you speak out more? Why stay so quiet while everything around you was on fire?" Melania's eyes didn't leave his. "Because I was never afraid of being misunderstood. I was afraid of what the media would do with my truth." The room didn't breathe. And Hinkle, ever the master of the dramatic pause, said nothing. It was Barron who finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "You don't invite people like my mother to understand her. You invite her to break her. And when she doesn't, you call her silent." Jonathan's fingers curled around the edge of his desk. There was no script left. No way out that didn't make him look either defensive or defeated. And for the first time in his career, the applause sign above the audience blinked. And no one clapped. Jonathan Hinkle stared at the blinking applause sign as if it had betrayed him. For years, it had been a silent partner in his performance, a signal to the audience, a cue to validate his every word, his every smirk, his every blow. But now it just blinked in vain, a hollow rhythm in a room that had turned introspective. He exhaled slowly and leaned forward, elbows on the desk, clasping his hands together. "All right," he said quietly, his tone shifting into something less theatrical and more personal. "Let's talk about silence then, because to many, Mrs. Trump, silence is complicity. The country was screaming, and you were folding Christmas ornaments, visiting children, speaking in measured tones. People didn't know what to do with that." Melania didn't respond immediately. She adjusted the sleeve of her dress slightly, more out of habit than discomfort. Then she met his gaze, unwavering. "I wasn't elected," she said. "I didn't sign up to play a role in your political drama. I did what I believed was right, in the only way I knew how. Quietly, carefully, with purpose." Her voice didn't rise, but its weight was undeniable. Jonathan opened his mouth, then paused. He looked at Barron, who hadn't taken a step back since stepping onto the stage. The boy who had once been a media mystery, now standing calmly in the center of the storm. There was something unsettling about his presence, not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it was firm, unapologetic, the exact opposite of what Jonathan had expected from the child of a former president. "What about you, Barron?" he asked, his tone still softer than before. "You've stayed out of the spotlight your whole life. You've watched your family be praised and ridiculed, often at the same time. Why now? Why speak up now?" Barron looked directly at him. His voice didn't tremble. His expression didn't shift. "Because I've spent my whole life listening to people like you tell the world who my parents are," he said. "And I've waited long enough to speak for myself." No one in the audience moved. No one dared. Melania turned to her son, her eyes softening not with pride alone, but with something deeper. Relief. Recognition. And Jonathan Hinkle, master of the last word, sat there in silence, realizing that tonight, his voice was no longer the loudest one in the room. Jonathan Hinkle sat back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him as the silence stretched longer than any producer would have ever allowed. But cutting it now would feel like weakness. So he stayed still, his fingers laced together in front of him, trying to process what had just been said. There was something about Barron's answer that struck deeper than expected. It wasn't just that the young man had spoken clearly. It was that he had done so without resentment, without trying to justify, excuse, or score points. He had simply spoken truth his own and now let it hang in the air. And the air felt heavier for it. The audience wasn't sure what to do. They had come expecting a confrontation, maybe even a collapse. But what they got was control, dignity, a reversal of roles so complete they could feel the discomfort in their own seats. They weren't watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a reckoning. Jonathan glanced at the index cards still scattered on his desk, questions crafted by producers, angles planned in meetings. None of them applied now. He could feel the control slipping further, and the part of him that built a career on confidence was quietly panicking. But another part of him, a quieter one buried beneath years of television instinct, wondered if maybe this was what truth felt like. He looked at Melania again, and for the first time that night, his tone lost all pretense. "Do you think," he asked slowly, "that the media ever gave you a fair chance?" Melania's answer was immediate. No. Her voice was steady, her posture unchanged. But in that single word was a weight that the room felt instantly. She didn't need to explain. The world had watched her be criticized for her accent, her clothes, her silence, her presence, for existing. Jonathan nodded slowly, and it wasn't the smug nod he had perfected over decades. It was smaller, almost human. "I suppose," he murmured, "we painted a version of you that was easier to digest." Barron didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence now said more than any words could. Because for the first time in Jonathan Hinkle's career, he wasn't the one pulling apart a guest for the audience's approval. He was the one being quietly unraveled, live on his own stage. The stillness in the room was now something sacred. No applause, no murmurs, no stage cues, just a room full of people who had expected a performance and instead found themselves witnessing something that felt far more raw, far more human. Jonathan Hinkle sat like a man caught between two versions of himself. The performer, the interrogator, the master of the cutting question. That part of him still sat upright, still searching for the next angle, the next line to regain control. But behind his eyes, another version of himself was waking up. The one who hadn't intended to feel anything tonight. The one who hadn't expected to be confronted not by outrage, but by composure. He looked at Melania again, not as a symbol, not as a name, but as a woman who had endured more than most could imagine without ever raising her voice. And then at Barron, still standing beside her, unwavering, his presence filling the space not with volume, but with conviction. Jonathan cleared his throat. "You know," he said slowly, For years, people assumed you were just part of the backdrop. That you were there to smile, say little, and disappear again. But tonight you walked into this room, and suddenly I'm not sure if any of us really knew who you were at all. Melania's lips curved, just barely. That was always the advantage, she said softly. You never saw me coming. A few scattered exhalations in the audience. Not quite laughter. Not quite gasps. Just breath, released all at once, as if they too had been holding something in. Barron stepped forward slightly, not out of aggression, but to shift the weight of the moment. You asked if we wanted people to forget, he said. But maybe the better question is, why did so many people stop listening before we ever had the chance to speak? It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a complaint. It was a mirror, one Jonathan hadn't expected to be handed tonight. And in that moment, the great interrogator of the left found himself not in control of the conversation, but surrounded by the very truths he had spent years trying to edit out of his show. Jonathan Hinkle leaned back ever so slightly, his fingers tapping faintly against the edge of his desk. Not nervously, he was too experienced for that, but with the energy of a man realizing that the old tools no longer worked. The clever traps, the framing, the rehearsed transitions, none of them could shift the gravity of this room back in his favor. He had spent years building a career on exposure, tearing down political figures, spinning narratives, challenging authority. But tonight, the authority in the room wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It came in the form of a mother who had never asked for the spotlight, and a son who had grown up in its harshest glare without ever truly stepping into it. And now, both stood in it, unafraid. Jonathan's tone softened, not from defeat, but from something else he hadn't felt in years, humility. I'll admit something, he said, his voice quieter. When I first heard you agreed to come on the show, Mrs. Trump, I thought it would be easy. I thought I knew the narrative. I thought I knew you. Melania didn't blink. She simply waited. She had nothing to prove. But watching you tonight, he continued, watching your son, his voice faltered just slightly, I realized maybe I was the one performing. Barron's eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in clarity. This was never a performance for us, he said. This is our life. Every insult, every false headline, every edited clip, you got to walk away from it after airtime. We lived in it. Jonathan sat quietly with that. The audience remained silent, as if sensing they had crossed into sacred ground. No camera movement, no whispered laughter. Just stillness. Finally, Melania spoke, her voice as steady as ever. You built a career on asking questions, she said. Maybe tonight it's time to start listening to the answers. And with that, the illusion cracked one final time. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the truth to slip through. The silence that followed Melania's words wasn't empty, it was loaded. It pulsed through the studio like a quiet tremor, unsettling and impossible to ignore. Even the producers behind the glass had stopped giving instructions. The teleprompter remained frozen, its scripted questions forgotten. What had begun as a carefully controlled segment was now something entirely different. Something Jonathan Hinkle had never experienced on his own stage. He stared at Melania for a long moment, his expression unreadable, not defensive, not hostile, but strangely reflective. As if the words had touched something he had buried under years of performance, ratings, and applause. In the audience, a woman in the third row, mid-60s, wearing a navy cardigan with an American flag pinned, folded her hands in her lap and nodded. Just once, she hadn't come to admire Melania Trump, but now something inside her had shifted. Maybe not politically, but humanly. Jonathan inhaled sharply, as if returning to his body. You say I should listen, he said, voice lower now, stripped of theatrics. But if I'm honest, I don't know if I'd recognize the truth anymore, even if I heard it. The admission stunned the room. No laughter, no scoffing, no clapping. Just a moment of rare honesty from a man known more for control than confession. Melania didn't gloat. She didn't seize the moment. Instead, she said simply, "Then maybe it's time you stop speaking until you can." Barron turned his head toward her, his expression proud, but not surprised. He had seen this strength before. Just never in front of cameras, never in a room this hostile. And yet, here she was, graceful, direct, unshakable. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if for the first time tonight, he was truly hearing her. He glanced toward Barron again. "And you? You've been silent for a long time, watching, waiting. I imagine that must have been lonely. Double quotes. Barron's reply was immediate. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's just patience waiting for the right moment. And tonight he had found it. The host of Leave with Hinkle was no longer leading an interview. He was learning from the very people he'd invited to be dismantled. For a moment, it felt as if time had slowed. No flashy transitions, no music swells, no applause to break the atmosphere. Just the weight of truth, and the rare silence of a man realizing he might not be the smartest person in the room after all. Jonathan Hinkle looked down at his desk, the cards scattered across its surface now meaningless. His carefully planned arc-opening jab, slow escalation, rhetorical ambush had fallen apart piece by piece. Not because his guests had fought back with rage or scandal, but because they had remained grounded in something far harder to weaponize: dignity. He glanced up again at Barron, who remained standing, arms relaxed, but shoulders squared. There was something remarkably controlled in his presence, like he had prepared his entire life for a moment like this, without ever knowing it. Not with media training, not with political ambition, but with something more basic and more powerful, a quiet understanding of who he was. "I wonder," Jonathan said finally, his voice no longer polished for television, but softened by something more human, "how many times I've mistaken patience for weakness." Melania turned toward him, her eyes thoughtful. "More than you know," she said. "But not more than you can change." There it was, an opening. Not a scolding, not an attack, a choice. The host nodded slowly, not to her, but to himself, somewhere deep inside, where the showman and the man were beginning to separate. He looked to Barron. "Do you regret stepping in tonight?" Barron didn't hesitate. "No." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Not even if it costs you something?" Barron's voice was calm. "Everything that matters already costs something. That doesn't mean you stay quiet." And for a moment, something passed between them, not approval, not agreement, but recognition. The kind of recognition that only comes when someone sees you and chooses not to look away. Melania rested a hand lightly on Barron's arm. He turned to her, just briefly, and for the first time all night, his expression softened not in uncertainty, but in connection. Mother and son, equal in presence, equal in strength. Jonathan Hinkle looked out at the silent crowd, then back at his guests, and realized with certainty. This was no longer his moment, but maybe, for once, it wasn't supposed to be. The tension that had once gripped the studio had morphed into something else entirely. It was no longer about confrontation. It had become about realization. And for Jonathan Hinkle, the realization was sharp and personal. He had come into this interview expecting to dismantle a carefully built image, but instead found himself facing the uncomfortable truth of his own assumptions. He shifted in his chair, this time not to reassert control, but to sit more honestly, less posed, less performative. The desk that had once been a fortress between him and his guests now felt like a barrier he no longer had the right to hide behind. "I have to admit something," he said, glancing between them. "When I started in this job, I really believed I was doing something important, holding people accountable, asking the questions no one else would dare to ask." He looked down at the edge of the table. His voice, for once, carried no echo of audience approval. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking to understand. I started asking to win." Melania didn't speak, but her eyes softened. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. The kind of grace that didn't excuse what had been done, but offered the possibility that it could stop repeating. Barron, still standing, folded his arms. Not defensively, but reflectively. There was a gravity in him that hadn't wavered once since he walked onto that stage. Not youthful defiance. Something steadier, deeper, earned. Jonathan met his eyes. "You know," he said quietly, "for years the media painted you as a mystery, the silent one, the one in the shadows. And now you're here, speaking with more conviction than most adults I've interviewed." Barron held his gaze. "That's because I learned by watching." Jonathan frowned slightly. "Watching who?" Barron turned his head just enough to glance at his mother, then back to the host. "My mother, every time she was attacked, she stood her ground. Not with outrage, not with panic, just silence and spine. That's how you learn to speak when you've watched what happens when you don't." The words settled like a weight across the studio. Not heavy in anger, but in truth. And truth, when spoken plainly, had a way of filling all the empty space left by spin. Jonathan leaned back, exhaled slowly, and looked out at the quiet crowd. "Maybe," he said, almost to himself, "it's not too late to start listening again." And for the first time that night, the audience didn't need a flashing sign to know when to respond. They stayed silent because they knew they had just witnessed something real. A quiet stir passed through the crowd, not a shift of restlessness, but of awakening. For an audience trained on outrage and applause lines, the silence felt unfamiliar. And yet, no one dared disturb it. It was as if the entire room understood instinctively. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something far more fragile. Jonathan Hinkle ran a hand across his notes, not to read them, but to feel them. The cards were useless now. Nothing printed there could guide him back to the version of the show he had expected. That show was gone. And in its place stood two people who had never asked to be heroes, never demanded sympathy, but who now held the entire room not through dominance, but through presence. Melania adjusted slightly in her chair, her hands folded gently in her lap. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't asked for understanding, but somehow she had earned it. Jonathan cleared his throat. "You know," he said, more carefully this time, "I've interviewed hundreds of politicians, celebrities, activists, and most of them couldn't sit through what you've just endured without breaking into defense or deflection." He turned to Melania, his voice quieter. "But you didn't flinch, not once, and I think that says more about you than any headline ever has." Melania didn't smile, but something in her eyes shifted like a door that had remained shut for years had just been unlocked. "I didn't come here to be defended," she said. "I came because for too long, people have spoken for me. Tonight, I wanted to speak for myself even if no one was listening." Jonathan nodded, slowly. "But someone was." He turned to Barron. "Someone was listening the whole time." Barron didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the floor for just a moment, then raised his eyes again, clear, steady, unshaken. "I always was." That moment hung in the air like a final note in a cathedral. Still, powerful, unforgettable. And somewhere in the back row, an older man wearing a veteran's cap wiped at his eye with the corner of his sleeve, not because he agreed with everything that had been said, but because he recognized something in that room that had been missing from public life for a long, long time: honor. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, but even that sound felt distant, now overshadowed by the silence that had taken root in the studio. Not the kind of silence born from awkwardness or discomfort, but the kind that only follows when people know they've witnessed something that matters. Jonathan Hinkle sat quietly, fingers loosely interlaced, the ever-confident host now fully stripped of his rehearsed armor. Across from him sat Melania, and beside her stood Barron, calm, dignified, unchanged in posture, yet transforming everything around him. It was Jonathan who spoke next, but this time there was no performance in his voice, no edge, no spin. "I never thought I'd say this on my own stage," he began slowly, "but I think I underestimated what silence can mean. I thought silence was surrender. I thought it was weakness. He paused, and for once, he didn't fill the space just to fill it. But watching the two of you tonight, I see it now. Silence can also be restraint. And sometimes it takes more strength to say nothing than it does to speak. Melania didn't nod. She didn't react at all. And yet, her stillness was an answer in itself. Barron finally broke the silence. His voice remained even, never sharp, but every word landed with weight. "People think I've had it easy because of my last name," he said. "But they don't see what comes with it, the pressure, the judgment, the lies. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to add fuel to the fire. But watching people twist the truth about my mother, that was the line." Jonathan looked at him closely, almost studying him, not as an opponent, but as a young man he hadn't expected to meet tonight. "You're not the boy the media made you out to be," he said. "No," Barron answered. "And she's not the woman you tried to corner either." A few heads in the audience turned slightly, quietly exchanging glances. Some of the faces that had entered with folded arms and preconceived opinions now showed something different, not agreement, but openness. Jonathan exhaled, his shoulders settling lower. "Maybe it's time we all stop trying to reduce people to headlines," he murmured. And for the first time in a long time on Live with Hinkle, the audience didn't wait for permission to feel something real. The camera crews, trained for years to capture applause lines and viral outbursts, didn't know what to focus on. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, no scandalous reveal, just the slow unraveling of assumptions and the quiet rebuilding of something more meaningful in their place. Jonathan Hinkle leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his hands no longer folded in confidence, but resting loosely in thought. The man who had made a career out of catching guests off guard now found himself disarmed. He looked at Melania again, really looked. Not through the lens of years-old headlines or filtered media narratives, but as a woman who had carried far more than she ever let on. "You've been called everything," he said softly. "Cold, silent, complicit, and yet here you are answering with more calm than most of us could ever manage." Melania didn't change expression, but her voice was even firm and unshaken. "I learned long ago that no matter what I say, some people will twist it. So I chose to speak less and do more." The audience, now fully absorbed, remained still. No one coughed. No one shifted. It was as if they feared missing a single word. Jonathan turned to Barron, studying him again, not out of suspicion this time, but of genuine curiosity. "And you," he said. "You could have stayed in the shadows forever. Most in your position would have, but tonight you walked straight into the fire." Barron's reply was as clear and direct as his gaze. "Sometimes the only way to put out a fire is to walk into it and show it doesn't scare you." Jonathan let out a slow breath, not as a tactic, but because the moment called for it. "You know," he said, "this wasn't the interview I planned." Barron tilted his head slightly. "That's because you planned to control it. There was no venom in the words, just truth. A truth that didn't demand applause. A truth that simply stood there, unwavering." Melania turned gently toward her son, her hand reaching once more for his arm. A quiet connection, unspoken, but powerful. The bond between mother and son now visible to millions in a way no photo or article had ever captured. And Jonathan, sitting in the studio he had built brick by brick from confrontation, realized for the first time that maybe the most powerful moments were the ones that made even him stop talking. For years, Jonathan Hinkle had believed that control meant dominance, that the one asking the questions was always the one writing the narrative. But tonight, as he sat beneath the studio lights that once felt like his personal spotlight, he felt something shift, not just around him, but within him. The room had changed. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't tense. It was quiet, but not empty. It was full of something that rarely survived in a television studio: honesty. He looked down at the worn edges of his desk. For a man obsessed with words, he suddenly found them lacking. "You know," he said quietly, not to the camera, not to the crowd, but directly to Melania. "I've spent years thinking that strong voices always speak the loudest, that silence meant submission." He looked up at her. "But tonight, I think I saw something else. Silence that isn't weakness, silence that comes from strength. And I wasn't ready for it." Melania held his gaze, her expression calm, her hand still resting lightly in her lap. "I was never silent because I had nothing to say," she replied gently. "I was silent because the noise around me was too loud to be heard over." The words hung in the air like a truth too long delayed. Jonathan turned toward Barron again, who stood with quiet poise, the same presence he had held since entering the stage. Not once had he raised his voice. Not once had he stepped forward with bravado. And yet, his presence had slowly become the axis around which the entire conversation turned. "I thought I was interviewing a former First Lady tonight," Jonathan said slowly. "But I think I've been taught something by a son." Barron's face didn't change. But behind his eyes, something softened. "I didn't come here to teach anyone," he said. "I came to stand with my mother." Jonathan nodded once slowly, respectfully. The audience remained still, but the shift was unmistakable. No longer was this about politics, about party lines or sound bites. It had become something human, something intimate. A glimpse behind the curtain the media had kept closed for so long. And somewhere in the far end of the audience, a man in a worn denim jacket whispered under his breath to the woman beside him. "I didn't expect to feel this." She didn't respond. She just reached for his hand and held it. The studio had taken on an almost sacred stillness, an invisible boundary where ego had no place. And vulnerability, for once, wasn't punished. It wasn't just a live show anymore. It was something else, something real. The kind of moment people don't expect from television. The kind that doesn't happen unless the script is forgotten entirely. Jonathan Hinkle sat forward slowly, resting his forearms on the desk. His voice had lost its edge, but in its place was something far more impactful: humility. "I'll be honest with you," he said, eyes fixed not on the cameras, but on Melania and Barron. "I didn't want to do this interview." That surprised everyone, even his producers behind the glass. "I thought it would be performative," he continued. "That you'd come here, spin a version of events, say a few carefully rehearsed lines, and we'd both walk away unchanged." Melania watched him with calm detachment, but Barron's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. It was the first time tonight that Jonathan had sounded like a man, not a host. Jonathan continued, "But I didn't expect you to sit here with this kind of stillness, this kind of grace. And I certainly didn't expect your son to step onto this stage and make me question my own voice." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't designed for headlines. But they carried weight, the kind of weight that could only come from a man who had spent years talking, and only now realized how little he had listened. Barron stepped forward, not aggressively, but firmly. "I didn't come here to change you," he said. "But if something I said makes you look twice at how people like my mother were treated, maybe that's enough." Jonathan looked at him, and for the first time, his expression was not one of skepticism or calculation, but of quiet respect. "I think I've spent more time tearing people apart than trying to understand them," he admitted. Melania finally spoke, her voice softer than before, almost gentle. "Then maybe tonight wasn't about answers. Maybe it was about remembering that people are more than politics." No one moved. No one interrupted. Because in that moment, on a stage once designed for conflict, there was only connection. For a long moment, the studio lights dimmed not in intensity, but in presence. It felt as though they were no longer illuminating a stage, but witnessing something far more intimate, a family bound by quiet strength, and a man in front of them slowly peeling away years of performance to meet them on level ground. Jonathan Hinkle sat quietly, the weight of his own words still settling around him. For once, he had nothing clever to say. No next question ready, no punchline queued up. And strangely, He didn't want one. He looked at Barron, taller now, more composed than any young man his age had a right to be. There was a stillness in him, not from uncertainty, but from intention. "You know," Jonathan said slowly, "people have made up stories about you since you were a child. They've mocked you, judged you, used your silence to fill in whatever narrative they wanted." Barron didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. He had lived through it. "And yet," Jonathan continued, "here you are. Not defending yourself, not lashing out, just showing up." Barron's voice was low, but firm. "I was raised to know the difference between power and noise." That landed. Not like a punch, but like a stone placed gently where it belonged. Melania placed her hand on her son's back, just for a second. No words, just a mother who had endured more than most ever would, letting the world see where her strength had gone, into him. Jonathan leaned back, folding his hands together again, this time not in performance, but in reverence. "I've asked a lot of questions in this chair," he said quietly, "but I don't think I've ever learned as much as I have in the last 20 minutes. There was no applause. No cue, no dramatic pause. Just silence and the unmistakable feeling that something had shifted not only in the room, but in the people watching from home. Far beyond the studio walls, across living rooms, hospital beds, kitchen tables, and quiet corners of America, the live broadcast continued. And for the first time in a long time, people weren't just watching, they were listening. There were no flashing banners, no yelling, no partisan filters blaring across the screen. Just three people, one host, one mother, one son sitting under the lights, stripping away the noise that had come to define the national conversation. In the studio, Jonathan Hinkle looked to the audience, not for validation, but for something he'd never sought before in his career, reflection. And what he saw was unexpected. Some leaned forward, elbows on knees, brows furrowed not in skepticism but thought. Others sat still, arms crossed not out of defiance, but in quiet concentration. They weren't reacting. They were absorbing. He turned back to Barron. "There's something strange about this moment," he said slowly. "It feels like, the more you two speak, the more I realize how much of our public life is just shouting past each other." Barron nodded once. "That's because most people in rooms like this aren't listening. They're waiting to reply." Jonathan half smiled, not sarcastically this time, but with a kind of reluctant admiration. "And you? You waited all this time just to say, what?" Barron didn't hesitate. "That my mother deserved better. Not just as a first lady, as a person." Melania didn't speak, but her hand rested gently on her son's arm again. And this time, it wasn't just a gesture of appreciation, it was grounding. It was strength meeting strength. Jonathan looked between them, something in his face softening further. "You're not who I thought you were," he said quietly. Melania finally answered, her voice calm. "You never tried to see us. You tried to fit us into your story." And that, more than anything said before, left the room in stunned stillness. Because for once, the story wasn't his. And the world watching knew it. Jonathan Hinkle sat quietly, the echo of Melania's words still pulsing in the space between them. "You never tried to see us. You tried to fit us into your story." It hadn't been said with anger, not even accusation, just clarity. The kind of clarity that couldn't be argued with because it wasn't trying to win, it was just true. For a moment, he looked down at his hands. The same hands that had pointed at guests, flipped through cue cards, controlled every moment of airtime for over a decade. But now, they rested still no longer tools of control, but reminders of how tightly he'd gripped the version of truth that served him best. He looked back up at Melania. Her face remained calm, unreadable, not cold, not defensive, just present, entirely herself. And beside her, Barron silent once again, but powerful in his stillness. Not a son hiding behind his mother, but a man who had stepped forward when it mattered most. Jonathan's voice was quiet now, almost hesitant. "I don't know if I ever actually wanted to see you," he admitted. "I think I wanted to define you first. That way, I didn't have to face the discomfort of being wrong." Melania didn't answer immediately. When she did, her words were soft but each one deliberate. "There is more strength in being wrong and growing than in pretending you were always right." The words hit Jonathan harder than he expected. Not because they were harsh, but because they stripped him bare. No applause. No defense. Just a man in front of two people he had misjudged, realizing that the armor he wore had protected nothing but pride. He leaned back, almost without realizing it, as if trying to catch his breath. Barron finally spoke again, voice low but firm. "You're not the only one who built stories, so did they. The press, social media, even people who never met us. But we kept showing up, quietly, patiently, and we're still here." The audience shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in resonance. And Jonathan, for once, wasn't trying to win. He was trying to understand what it meant that for years he had spoken to millions, but never truly heard the one sitting right in front of him. The cameras were still rolling, but no one cared anymore. Not the producers behind the glass, not the cameramen frozen behind their lenses, and certainly not the audience. What had started as a scheduled segment had become something that couldn't be timed or trimmed. It had become real. Jonathan Hinkle let out a breath through his nose, not out of frustration, but out of quiet surrender. The kind that comes when you stop fighting what's already true. He looked at his desk as sanctuary, his shield, and then up at the mother and son who had just dismantled a decade of assumptions without ever raising their voices. "I've spent most of my life in front of a camera," he said slowly, "but right now I feel more exposed than anyone on this stage." Melania met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something new in her eyes. Not victory, not relief, compassion. "Then maybe it's time you start asking questions to understand, not to trap." He nodded slightly, not in defense but agreement. The audience didn't applaud. It would have ruined the weight of the moment. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't about sides anymore. It was about truth. And truth, once it shows itself, makes noise feel small. Jonathan turned to Barron again. "You know what's strange?" he said. "I came here tonight thinking you were a mystery, a quiet shadow in a noisy family. But you might be the one person who truly sees what's going on." Barron didn't look flattered, just focused. "I've seen enough to know most people talk to be heard. But the people who change things listen first." A ripple moved through the audience, not applause, not gasps, just a collective breath. As if they too were remembering something they'd forgotten. That stillness wasn't the absence of power. Sometimes it was the source of it. Jonathan looked around his studio, his domain. But it no longer felt like a throne. It felt like a mirror. And for the first time, he didn't turn away. Jonathan Hinkle remained still in his chair, his shoulders now visibly lower. The crisp posture of a performer softened into something more human. The lights above no longer flattered, they revealed. And what they revealed wasn't weakness. It was something far rare on a stage built for spectacle, humility. He looked once more at Melania, then at Barron. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, almost reflective. "I've spent so much of my life searching for contradictions," he said, "looking for cracks in people. Moments where they stumble. That's how you win the room. That's how you control the story." He paused, letting the weight of his own admission settle in the silence. "But tonight, I didn't find cracks. I found conviction, and it didn't come from shouting. It came from restraint." Barron didn't react, he just listened. As he had been doing the entire evening. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "How did you learn that?" he asked. "At your age, how did you learn to hold your ground without swinging back?" Barron's answer was simple, but carried more strength than any raised voice ever could. "By watching someone who did it every day, no matter how unfair it got." He looked toward his mother, not for permission, not for praise, but simply to acknowledge what had always been true. Melania didn't need to speak. The emotion in her eyes, so subtle, so carefully held back, said everything. Jonathan sat with that. No follow-up, no snark, no pivot. He finally turned back to the camera. And for the first time in his career, he spoke not to his audience, but to himself out loud, for all to hear. I think I've spent too long mistaking cynicism for insight, and silence for guilt. Then he looked back at them, voice steady. Tonight, you taught me the difference. And for a moment, the lights above the stage didn't feel like spotlights. They felt like sunlight breaking through after a long storm. The quiet in the room was no longer awkward, it was reverent. A stillness that didn't beg to be broken, because everyone instinctively knew. This was the part of the story no one dared interrupt. Not with applause, not with commentary, just presence. Jonathan Hinkle slowly stood up from his chair, something he rarely did during interviews. But this didn't feel like an interview anymore. It felt like something closer to confession. He didn't pace. He didn't move for effect. He simply stood there, his notes forgotten. The studio lights no longer a performance backdrop, but witnesses to his own shift. I've made a name, he began, out of asking questions that corner people, that provoke, that expose. He looked out at the audience, his audience. And the truth is, it worked. It got views. It built a brand. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking questions to learn. I started asking to win. He turned to Melania and Barron, his voice steadier now. You didn't come here with talking points. You didn't play the game. And because of that, I saw something I didn't expect to find on this stage. He paused just for a moment before finishing. Character. Barron remained still, his eyes locked with the host's. There was no triumph in his gaze, just truth. Quiet, undeniable, and absolute. Melania stood slowly now beside her son, not to respond. Not to counter, but to be present as she always had been. Not with fire, but with grace. Jonathan looked at them both, and for a second, the mask that had defined him, the smirk, the edge, the showman's pride was completely gone. And what remained was a man facing the one thing he had avoided his entire career, his own blind spots. In the audience, no one moved, no one whispered, no one reached for their phone, because moments like this don't happen often. And when they do, you hold your breath, so you don't miss a second of it. Jonathan Hinkle remained standing, hands gently clasped in front of him. The man who once towered over guests with verbal precision now stood at eye level, not only physically but morally. And that was new, for him, for the audience, for everyone. Melania didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her presence said everything. That after years of being misjudged, misquoted, and misunderstood, she had finally been seen not by the world, but by the very person who once profited from misrepresenting her. Jonathan looked down briefly, almost as if ashamed to meet her gaze. Then he turned toward Barron. You've grown up in the shadows of judgment, he said. Most people in your position would have hardened, grown cynical. But you chose to step into the light tonight. Why now? Barron held his gaze. His voice, though soft, cut through the silence like a bell. Because sometimes the longer you wait to speak, the more powerful your voice becomes. He didn't say it to impress. He said it because it was real. And the audience felt it viscerally, as if something unspoken within them had just been named. Jonathan nodded slowly, lips pressing together as he swallowed the emotion forming in his throat. I thought this show was about asking hard questions, he said. But maybe the hardest question is the one I've never dared to ask myself. He paused. What if I've been wrong? No one moved. Melania stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. Being wrong is not failure, she said. Staying wrong is. It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't an attack. It was the kind of truth that didn't shame, that freed. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again wider, clearer. The man who had opened the show with smirks and jabs now stood humbled, not defeated. And the crowd so trained for spectacle sat still in reverence, because they knew. This wasn't about who won. This was about who changed. The studio felt transformed, no longer a stage for confrontation, but a place of reckoning. The bright lights hadn't dimmed, but their purpose had. They weren't shining on a performance. They were exposing something raw, something rare, something real. Jonathan Hinkle's breathing had slowed. His voice, once a finely tuned instrument of control, now carried something it never had before: sincerity. He looked toward the audience, then back to Melania and Barron. "I've spent years telling stories about people like you," he said, his words measured. "But tonight, you told your own. And the difference?" He let the pause linger. "I finally believed it." Melania tilted her head slightly, not in triumph, but in peace. "That was always the difference," she said. "We lived it. You narrated it." The crowd didn't stir, but the emotional undercurrent was almost physical now. People were leaning in, not toward the host, but toward the truth slowly unfolding before them. Jonathan turned to Barron, his tone almost reverent. "You've been silent for most of your life. Your name, your face, your family used by the media as symbols, as punchlines, as mysteries. But tonight, you stood on this stage, and all of that stopped." Barron didn't blink. His voice came calmly, clearly. "It didn't stop, it changed. Because I stopped letting others speak for me." Jonathan held his gaze, and in that brief silence, something passed between them, not politics, not performance, but recognition. "I was wrong about you," Jonathan said simply. Barron stepped forward, not to gloat, but to finish the thought. "You were never meant to understand us through headlines. You were supposed to look deeper. Tonight you finally did." And for once, Jonathan Hinkle, the man with all the questions, had none left. Only the quiet realization that the most powerful answers he'd ever heard came from the very people he had once underestimated the most. The room felt weightless now, not because the tension was gone, but because it had transformed. What once pressed down as conflict now lifted like understanding. The audience wasn't clapping, shouting, or reacting. They were absorbing, feeling, processing the conversation that had stripped away performance and left something undeniably human behind. Jonathan Hinkle took a slow step back toward his chair. Not to sit, but to steady himself. It had been years since he'd felt unguarded in front of an audience. But tonight, in the presence of two people he had come prepared to dismantle, he stood humbled and strangely relieved. He looked at Melania. "I don't know if I'll ever see the world the way you do," he said sincerely. "But I see you now, not as a symbol, not as a headline, as a person." Melania's response came without hesitation. "That's all I ever wanted." Then Jonathan turned toward Barron. "And you didn't have to be here. You could have stayed off camera, out of it. But you chose to stand up. Why?" Barron looked directly at him, his voice firm. "Because silence may protect you for a while. But one day, you realize it's protecting the wrong people." A murmur moved through the audience, not shock, not resistance, but something softer, agreement. They had come expecting spectacle, and instead, they had been handed truth. Jonathan's expression changed. His shoulders lowered, his posture loosened. There was nothing left to prove. He looked down for a moment, gathering himself, then raised his eyes back to the two guests across from him. "I don't know what this moment will mean to the people watching, but I know what it means to me." He paused, letting the words settle on their own. "It means I still have a lot to learn." And with that, the studio, so often a place of division, became, if only for a moment, a place of grace. Jonathan Hinkle stood in the quiet hum of the studio, no longer the man who had opened the show, arms outstretched, voice sharp, ready to provoke. That man had slowly unraveled under the weight of what he hadn't expected: dignity that didn't flinch, and truth that didn't need volume. He glanced to the side. toward the camera lights that had once felt like allies. Now they simply observed, unjudging, neutral, like the country itself watching, waiting to see if the people on its stages could still grow. He turned back to Melania and Barron. "I've done a lot of interviews," he said, voice quieter now. "Senators, governors, presidents, but I don't think any of them ever left me feeling like this." Melania tilted her head slightly. "Like what?" Jonathan searched for the word, and when he found it, he almost whispered it. "Honest." Barron said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was no longer mysterious, it was powerful. Everyone in the room understood that now. Jonathan looked at the floor, then slowly back up. "I came here to expose something," he admitted. "But instead, I was the one exposed." Melania's eyes met his, and this time there was warmth in them. Not triumph, just quiet acknowledgement. She didn't need him to fall. She needed him to see. And now finally he had. He looked once more at Barron. "You've made me rethink a lot tonight," he said, almost smiling. "Maybe that's what growing up in silence does. It makes your words count when you finally speak." Barron gave a single nod, and for the first time in the entire broadcast, there was a pause that felt complete, not empty, not unfinished, just full. Then Jonathan turned slowly toward the audience. "I don't know what headline they'll write about tonight," he said, "but I hope, just once, they leave the spin behind." And in that moment, the entire room knew. This wasn't the end of an interview. It was the beginning of something else. The lights above remained unchanged, but everything else in the studio had shifted. The energy, the roles. Even the silence felt different, now less like a pause, more like a decision. The audience, usually quick to laugh or clap, remained hushed. Not out of tension, but out of respect. Jonathan Hinkle stood motionless for a long moment. Not because he was unsure of what to say, but because, for once, he didn't want to say the wrong thing. The words that used to come so easily now felt heavier, more sacred. He looked back at Barron, then to Melania. And then, quietly, he turned his eyes to the crowd. "You know," he began, "we talk a lot on this show about truth, about responsibility, about holding people accountable. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that holding people accountable doesn't mean robbing them of their humanity." There was a weight to his words that couldn't be faked. Not after tonight. He looked back at Melania. "I owe you something," he said, clearly. "I owe you the respect I didn't give you when it mattered." Melania didn't gloat. She didn't shift in her seat. She just responded with quiet grace. "Then give it to the next person they try to destroy." That landed harder than anything yet. Jonathan's jaw tightened for a moment, not in defiance, but in acceptance. He nodded slowly, carrying the sentence like a stone in his chest. He wasn't just hearing her, he was feeling her. Then he turned to Barron. "I underestimated you," he said. "And in doing so, I underestimated something bigger, the strength of someone raised in grace." Barron didn't answer with a soundbite. He simply said, "I didn't come here to be underestimated or admired. I came to remind you we're still human." And just like that, the air in the room grew still again, not heavy, clear. Because sometimes the most powerful shift in a nation isn't made in the halls of Congress, but in a quiet studio, when the person asking the questions finally learns how to listen. The lights above seemed softer now, though they hadn't changed. It was the room that had transformed no longer a battleground, but something closer to a sanctuary. For the first time in years, the studio didn't feel like a place where reputations were broken. Tonight, something had been restored. Jonathan Hinkle slowly lowered himself back into his chair, not out of exhaustion, but out of reverence. He no longer occupied the seat as a host. He sat as a man who had finally taken off the armor he'd worn for so long. He'd forgotten how heavy it was. He looked to the crowd, not to perform, just to witness. "Most of you came here tonight expecting fireworks," he said softly. "You came expecting the usual script tension, sound bites, someone to cheer for, and someone to tear apart. He paused, letting the silence validate the truth of that ... But instead, what you got, what we all got, was something more rare than controversy. He turned back to Melania and Barron, his voice steady but changed. We got courage. Melania didn't respond. She simply looked back at him with the same grace she had carried the entire evening. Jonathan turned to Barron. And from you, he added, we got clarity. Barron, standing tall, nodded once, quietly acknowledging the moment, not seizing it. Jonathan's voice dropped to a near whisper now, as if afraid to disturb the balance of the room. I've spent years trying to win arguments. But tonight, I lost one, and I think I'm better for it. A rustle moved through the audience, shoulders relaxing, eyes blinking slower, breaths deepening. It wasn't approval. It was awakening ... Because they had come to watch a takedown. But what they witnessed was something no trending clip could capture. A man being humbled. A son stepping forward, and a mother finally heard. And somewhere across the country, on screens both large and small, millions sat in stunned silence. Not outraged, not entertained, but changed. Outside the studio, the world kept turning. Traffic buzzed through the streets. Phones lit up with headlines. Social media feeds filled with half-formed opinions. But inside this room, this unlikely cathedral of truth, time had slowed. Jonathan Hinkle exhaled, long and steady. For years, he had been the voice that shaped narratives, the mind behind the questions that cornered, the tone that steered the national conversation. But now he was something far more dangerous. He was listening. He looked toward the audience, and then toward the camera, no longer as a host, but as a witness. To those watching at home, he said, voice clear and stripped of artifice. If you came here tonight expecting a fight, I hope what you found instead was something more powerful. He looked at Barron. Conviction without arrogance. Then to Melania, and grace without apology. The words settled over the room like snowfall, gentle, pure, undeniable. Melania stood now, slow and deliberate, but not hesitant. She stepped forward beside her son, not to dominate the stage, but to reclaim it on her terms. Not as a symbol, not as a headline. As a woman. Barron, silent again, remained tall beside her. Jonathan rose to meet them. I started this show years ago to challenge people, he said, to confront them. But somewhere along the way, I stopped confronting myself. He extended his hand, not performatively, not for the camera, but sincerely. And Melania took it, one firm shake, no smile. Just clarity. Then Barron did the same. And at that moment, for the first time in the show's history, there was no outro music. No applause sign, no cut to commercial. Just the image of a broken narrative being quietly rebuilt by the very people it tried to silence. The lights still burned overhead, but they no longer felt like instruments of pressure. They had softened somehow. Not dimmed, but redefined like the stage itself. What was once designed to expose weakness now revealed something else. Quiet resilience. Jonathan Hinkle stood still behind his desk, the show's usual rhythm now long abandoned. There was no timing to stick to, no producers waving from behind the glass. The story had taken over. And for once, he wasn't fighting it. He turned again to Barron, who remained centered, silent, composed, unwavering. There was no smugness in him, no hidden satisfaction. He had spoken his truth, and now stood in it. Jonathan exhaled slowly. I've had political giants on this stage. I've debated senators, grilled authors, even gone viral for shouting down a Supreme Court nominee. But tonight, he looked down at the desk briefly. Tonight I learned something from a young man who never raised his voice. He looked back up, meeting Barron's eyes. You didn't have to fight to be heard. You just had to be undeniable. Barron remained still. The truth doesn't shout, it waits. Jonathan blinked once, slowly, the words landing somewhere he didn't expect. He turned to Melania. I judged you before you ever walked on this stage. I expected you to crumble. But you didn't. You stood taller than most of the men who sat in that chair." Melania nodded once, not in pride, but in understanding. "I've been called cold for years," she said calmly. "But it was never coldness. It was focus. And I learned to use silence. Because I knew the world would use my words against me." The audience listened with rapt attention. Some leaned forward. Others sat frozen. The room no longer wanted a dramatic ending. They wanted every second of this moment to last. Jonathan straightened his posture again, something flickering behind his eyes. Not quite guilt, not quite redemption. Something in between. "I think we all made up our minds about you before ever hearing you speak," he said softly. "But now that we've heard you, now that we've really heard you, maybe it's time to ask ourselves why we never tried before." Barron finally broke his stillness. Just a single step forward. Then, "Maybe you were never afraid of us. Maybe you were afraid we'd make you question your version of the world." Jonathan didn't respond. Because for the first time in a very long time, he didn't know how to. The silence in the room was no longer the result of shock. It was deliberate, chosen. A room full of people, producers, audience members, even the host holding their breath. Not out of fear, but because they didn't want to miss what was unfolding. Jonathan Hinkle remained frozen behind his desk, Barron's last words echoing in his mind like a slow tremor. "Maybe you were never afraid of us. Maybe you were afraid we'd make you question your version of the world." The sentence didn't sting, it unsettled. And in that discomfort, something began to break, not in a dramatic collapse, but in quiet surrender. A surrender of certainty, of ego, of the version of truth he had so carefully curated for years. He slowly turned to the audience, scanning the faces that had so often mirrored his outrage, his smugness, his conclusions. But tonight, they were different. They weren't here for him anymore. They were watching something bigger. And maybe better. "I always believed the best way to challenge someone was to press them," he said, his voice slower now. "Corner them, make them slip. That's how you find the truth under pressure." He looked to Melania, then to Barron. But tonight, the truth didn't come from pressure, it came from stillness. Melania didn't react. But something in her presence, the way she stood so calmly, hands folded, expression serene, amplified his words. She wasn't just part of the story anymore. She was the part that made the noise irrelevant. Jonathan turned again to Barron. "I don't know what this means for you moving forward," he said. "I don't know if this moment will change anything outside these walls. But inside here," he placed a hand flat on his desk, steadying himself, "I don't think anything will ever be the same again." Barron didn't answer, not yet, because for the first time tonight, he knew Jonathan was finally listening, not with rebuttal, but with open hands. Barron stood in silence for a moment longer, his hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze steady, not confrontational, not condescending. Just real, and in that stillness, Jonathan Hinkle understood something he had never grasped in all his years behind the desk. There was more power in composure than in any line of questioning he had ever delivered. Barron finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "You spent years shaping people's perceptions," he said. "But you forgot that some stories don't belong to you. They never did." Jonathan didn't argue. He didn't reach for control. He nodded just slightly. It was the first time in his career that he accepted the weight of words he couldn't outmaneuver. Melania stepped forward gently, her heels quiet on the stage floor, her voice calm. "I was never afraid of being misunderstood," she said. "But I was disappointed that no one ever asked who I really was. They just decided." The line struck the room like a soft tremor. And in the silence that followed, something shifted in the audience. Not sympathy, but recognition. Because deep down, everyone knows what it feels like to be misjudged. To be spoken about before being spoken to. Jonathan looked up, blinking slowly. "I'm trying," he said, genuinely, with no defense left in him. "I don't know if it's too late. but I am." Barron took another step forward. "It's not about you being too late. It's about whether you're willing to stop being the center of everything." The line didn't come with anger. It came with truth. And truth doesn't need volume. Jonathan leaned back slightly, almost as if Barron's words had forced him to see himself clearly for the first time. And for the first time in his own studio, he didn't just question others. He questioned himself. The lights no longer felt warm or cold, they simply were. No longer part of a show, no longer a tool of dramatics. They now lit a space where something far more powerful than performance was taking place. Accountability. Jonathan Hinkle remained seated, no longer controlling the rhythm. He wasn't driving the conversation, he was catching up to it. And that, more than anything, marked a turning point. He looked at Barron, then at Melania, and then down at his desk as if searching for the remnants of who he had been just an hour ago. "You know," he said, voice quieter, "I've spent years believing that the way to survive in media is to never admit when you're wrong, to deflect, to double down." He looked up slowly. But that kind of survival kills something else along the way, something important. The word hung in the air heavy, earned. It didn't ask for pity. It asked to be felt. Barron, arms still loosely at his sides, spoke with that same calm presence that had carried him through the entire night. "Then maybe tonight wasn't about exposing us," he said. "Maybe it was about you. Realizing you're more than the role you've been playing." Jonathan looked directly at him and for once didn't blink. He simply nodded. And that was enough. In the audience, something happened that no one expected. A single person, an older woman in the front row, slowly stood up. Not clapping, just rising. As if she too understood what had just taken place. A reckoning, a turning, a release. Others followed, not in protest, not in adoration, just in stillness. A quiet standing ovation, not for a performance, but for the truth that had finally been allowed to speak. And Jonathan Hinkle sat in the center of it all. Not as the hero, not as the villain, but as a man. Still learning how to be honest. The quiet standing ovation had no music, no cue, no direction. It was instinct. A collective realization that something important had happened, not a political victory, not a media moment, but a human one. Jonathan Hinkle remained seated, humbled not by defeat, but by truth. He glanced toward the audience, many of whom still stood silently, hands clasped or resting by their sides. Some held back tears. Others simply stared, as if afraid to look away and miss something sacred. He looked at Melania, and for the first time in his career, his voice faltered, not from nerves, but from emotion. "I don't know how to undo the things I've said about you," he admitted. "The assumptions, the mockery. The years I treated you as an idea, not a person." Melania took a breath and stepped forward, not closer to him, but deeper into her own presence. "You can't undo it," she said gently. "But you can stop repeating it." Jonathan gave the faintest nod. He knew it wasn't forgiveness. It was a line drawn in the sand, one that said, "Step across or stay behind." Then he turned to Barron. "You were never meant to be part of this world," he said. "But tonight you didn't just walk into it, you owned it." Barron looked at him, eyes clear, voice low. "I didn't come here to be owned by the story. I came to reclaim it." Another wave of stillness passed through the room. This wasn't television anymore. It was memory. A moment that would linger, not because of who spoke, but because of who listened. But he didn't say anything, because there was nothing left to say, just the image of a mother and her son, standing tall, not as symbols, not as victims, but as a truth the world had tried to silence and could no longer ignore. The silence in the studio hadn't lifted, it had deepened. Like fog settling over a landscape, not to obscure, but to soften the edges of everything people once believed with certainty. Jonathan Hinkle sat quietly, almost smaller now, not because he had been diminished, but because something inside him had been humbled, For years he had commanded this space, the center, the voice, the architect of conflict. But now the center of gravity had shifted, and it stood tall, steady beside him. Melania Trump looked out at the audience, her expression composed, but no longer guarded. She had said what she needed to say. And more importantly, she had been heard. Jonathan broke the silence, this time with no pretense of authority. "You know," he began slowly, "I used to think strength was measured by how loudly someone could push back, how fast they could counter a narrative." He looked at Barron. "But watching you tonight, I realized real strength looks different." Barron tilted his head slightly. "It does," he said. "Because real strength isn't about pushing others down. It's about standing still when the world is trying to erase you." Jonathan took a long, steady breath. "I erased you," he said. "Both of you. Not with one moment, but over time, with every assumption I didn't question, every headline I never challenged." Melania stepped forward, not closer to him, but forward in her truth. "And now you see us." Jonathan nodded. "I do." A beat passed, then another. And suddenly, it wasn't just the host who had changed. It was the crowd, the viewers, the tone, the temperature. The country watching in real time as one of their most combative voices stopped talking and started understanding. Somewhere miles away, a television stayed on longer than usual in a veteran's home. In a diner in Oklahoma, two strangers who never agreed on anything sat silently watching together. And in millions of households across America, something rare happened. People didn't change sides, they changed hearts. The applause never came, and that was exactly right. Because this wasn't a performance, it was a reckoning. A moment between people who had nothing left to prove, only something left to face. Jonathan Hinkle looked at the space between him and Barron Trump, just a few feet. But emotionally, it had once been miles. And now, somehow, those miles had collapsed into this quiet understanding. He stood slowly, no longer the host, the voice of the network, the man behind the questions. He stood simply as himself. "I used to believe people were either one thing or the other," he said. "Heroes or villains, right or wrong, strong or fragile. But tonight," he looked between Barron and Melania, "you showed me what it means to be all of those things at once, and still be standing." Barron didn't smile. He didn't need to. His calm presence had already become the loudest voice in the room. "We didn't come here to change your mind," he said. "We came here so you'd stop pretending you already knew who we were." The audience shifted slightly, not in discomfort, in awe. Melania took one final step forward, her posture unshaken. "The truth isn't loud," she said, "but it lasts longer." Jonathan swallowed hard. There was nothing left in his voice now but truth. "I'll never see this stage the same way again." He turned not to the cameras, not to the producers, but to the two people who had taken everything thrown at them and responded with nothing but clarity. And then, unexpectedly, he said something no one saw coming. "Thank you." Simple, sincere. A man known for exposing weakness, now choosing to honor strength. The lights never dimmed. There was no dramatic fade-out, no scripted ending. Just the three of them, Melania, Barron, and Jonathan, frozen in a moment that didn't need special effects to feel eternal. Jonathan Hinkle slowly stepped away from his desk, not to end the segment, but to mark the shift, the end of a show, and the beginning of something more difficult, more honest. He looked at the audience one last time. They were still. Not stunned, not confused, just awake. He turned to Melania. "You carried so much in silence, and we called it emptiness, but tonight we saw what was really there." Melania gave the smallest nod. "You saw me, finally." Then he looked at Barron. "You didn't demand this stage. You claimed it, and somehow, without saying much at all, you changed everything." Barron's reply was simple, unwavering. "I didn't come to speak louder than anyone. I came to speak clearly for her." That was it. A son's final word, a mother's final grace, a host's final reckoning. Melania placed her hand gently on her son's back, and together they turned, not to leave, but to exit with purpose. They didn't wait for applause. They didn't need it. They had reclaimed the narrative on their terms, in their truth, with their dignity intact. As they walked off the stage, Jonathan remained frozen in place. Not out of indecision, but out of reverence. He had spent years searching for moments that would trend. But tonight, he had witnessed something that wouldn't just trend, it would echo. And as the screen finally faded to black, no logo, no jingle, no sound, just one line remained in silence. Sometimes the quietest voices leave the loudest legacy. Fade out. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or simply feel something deeper, then this is the place for you. Here, we don't chase noise, we follow truth. One story at a time. So if you still believe in dignity, in strength, and in voices that rise without shouting, subscribe now and join us. Because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us forever.